The wind blew dry through the cottonwoods, rattling their brittle leaves like old bones. Jed Hollis stood on the porch of his cabin, leaning against a post that had started to rot at the bottom but still held firm enough to bear his weight. His eyes, half-shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, faded by sun and time, scanned the empty stretch of land in front of him. Nothing moved but the dust. That was how he liked it. Or at least, that's what he told himself. It had been 20 years since he buried Martha. 20 years since laughter echoed off the rafters of his home, or someone set a second plate at the table. He'd tried to fill the silence with work, mending fences, tending horses, rebuilding the same barn beam twice just to keep his hands busy. But the cabin had gone quiet, and over time so had he. Folks in town said he talked more to his mule than to people. That wasn't far from the truth. Inside, the house smelled like oil lamps and old wood. Dust settled in the corners like it belonged there, like it had taken up permanent residence. The kitchen held remnants of long-finished meals, the plates stacked neatly but never used. Jed wasn't lazy, just tired. Not the kind of tired sleep could fix, but the deep weariness that comes from being alone too long. That morning, he'd sat at the table staring at the worn floorboards, thinking about how they creaked differently now. How they echoed instead of absorbed. And for reasons he didn't quite understand, he pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote in blocky handwriting, "Help wanted, cabin cleaning, cash paid, inquire at general store." He pinned it to the board near the register with a rusted nail. Didn't say much to the shopkeep, just nodded once and left. He didn't expect much. The next day, she showed up. She stepped onto his porch with a soft knock, her boots barely making sound on the wood. Her hair was pulled back under a faded scarf, and her dress was plain, well-kept, but mended in more than one place. Her eyes were the kind that looked like they'd seen too much, too early. But they were steady. "You posted this?" she asked, holding up the note. Jed looked her over. She wasn't what he'd expected. He figured maybe some young girl looking to make a few coins, or an old widow needing something to pass the time. But she stood there with calm purpose, hands folded, eyes not quite meeting his. "I did," he said. "I can clean. I'm fast. And I don't break things," she added. He stared at her a moment longer, then stepped aside. "Ain't much to break anyway." She crossed the threshold like someone stepping into a church. Slow, respectful. Her eyes moved across the room, and Jed noticed how she didn't flinch at the dust or the stale smell. She didn't make any comments, didn't wrinkle her nose. She just nodded. "I'll need water," she said. He pointed to the pump outside, buckets by the post. She gave a small nod and turned on her heel, heading out with quiet confidence. He watched her go. There was something in the way she moved, controlled, graceful even, but not fragile. Like someone used to hard work. She didn't speak much as she worked. Didn't ask questions about the house or about him. She scrubbed the floor on her knees with a rag and a bucket of hot water, wiped down every shelf, every table. She even reached behind the stove, grunting softly as she shifted it away from the wall. Jed hadn't seen anyone do that since Martha. From time to time, he'd glance over from the porch or the barn, half expecting her to tire out or skip corners. But she didn't. She worked through the day, pausing only once to wipe sweat from her brow with the back of her sleeve. She didn't complain. When the sun started to dip low, she stood in the doorway, hands clasped. "That'll do for today," she said. "I'll come back tomorrow, if that's all right." Jed nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few folded bills. "It's all right." She hesitated, then took the money. "Thank you, mister." "Hollis," he said. "Jed Hollis." "I'm Clara," she said. "Clara May." They stood in silence for a moment, neither seeming to know what to say next. Then she gave a faint smile, barely there, and turned to leave. She walked down the dirt path leading from the house toward the main road, her figure outlined by the last light of the day. Jed watched until she was no longer visible. Something in his chest shifted. A rustle, a stir, like when a locked window gets opened for the first time in years. The next morning, she came again. No knock this time, just the sound of the bucket filling at the pump and her soft footsteps on the porch. She cleaned the pantry shelves, rehung the curtains, scrubbed the windows inside and out. She even mended a loose drawer handle with a bit of string and a small nail she carried in her apron. She didn't ask for tools, she just fixed it. "You always do this kind of work?" Jed asked from the doorway. She looked up from where she was brushing cobwebs from the rafters. "I do what I can, when I can." He nodded, chewing the inside of his cheek. Her voice was calm, sure, but her eyes stayed guarded. Around noon, he set out a plate of bread and cheese on the table. She noticed, but didn't touch it until he'd gone back outside. When he returned later, the plate was clean, the crumbs swept neatly into her palm and thrown out the back door. She kept the same pattern the next few visits, arriving early, leaving before sunset. Always finishing her tasks with care, but never lingering, never sitting. She never used his name unless she had to, and she never spoke about where she came from or where she went at night. He wanted to ask. More than once, the words came close to the edge of his tongue, but something about her silence made him hold back. It wasn't cold or distant. It was protective. One afternoon, she found his wife's old photograph tucked in a drawer while dusting the sitting room. Jed had forgotten it was even there. "She was lovely," Clara said softly, setting the frame on the mantel. Jed said nothing for a moment, just looked at the photo. Then, "She was." Clara didn't press. She just wiped the glass clean and stepped away. After she left that day, Jed sat in his rocking chair, staring at the photo. The way Clara had handled it, with respect, not pity, left an ache in his chest. He hadn't felt anything that deep in a long time. Each day she came, the house felt a little more like it used to, the air less stale, the rooms less empty. He found himself fixing up things just because she'd be seeing them, mending a crack in the window frame, replacing a loose stair plank. He even cleared out the barn loft, something he hadn't done in over a decade. He didn't know what he was doing exactly, or why it mattered that much. But it did. On the 5th week, as she gathered her shawl and stepped outside, Jed followed her out, just far enough to see her off the property line. "You ever think about staying longer?" he asked. She turned, surprised. "Why?" "Don't know," he admitted. "Cabin's quieter when you're gone, that's all." She studied him. Not suspicious. Not cold, just watchful. "I have things to tend to," she said. He nodded. "Of course." She hesitated, then added, "But I'll be here same time next week." He watched her leave again, the light catching on her scarf, the wind tugging at the hem of her dress as her figure shrank down the road and eventually disappeared into the trees. Something about the way she moved, the silence she left behind, stayed with him long after she was gone. That night he sat at the table with one chair pulled out, as if someone else might take it. Just for a moment. Then he shook his head, chuckled once, and pushed it back in. But when he lay down to sleep, he couldn't help but picture her standing by the hearth, sleeves rolled, humming low while she worked. And for the first time in 20 years, the silence didn't feel so final. Jed stood in the barn doorway, long after the rooster had crowed, hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. The morning fog still curled in the low fields like it hadn't decided whether to stay or lift. He should have been mending fence or checking on the calf that was due soon. But he hadn't moved since Clara left the day before. Something about the way she'd rushed out, faster than usual, eyes scanning the tree line like she was late for something heavier than chores, stuck in his chest like a splinter he couldn't dig out. It had been almost 2 months since she started coming. His house no longer smelled of must and quiet. The floor shone. The windows let in light. The curtains moved gently with the breeze like someone had remembered to open them. He told himself he hired her out of practicality, and maybe that had been true at the start. But now, when she didn't come, the hours stretched out in a way that felt unbearable. He'd asked her once if she lived far. She'd just said, "Not too far," with a small smile that shut the door on any more questions. He didn't push, but now he couldn't stop thinking about it. That afternoon, he took his horse and rode into town under the excuse of needing a new bag of feed and a bolt of cloth. The general store was quiet, save for the clerk's boy sweeping the back aisle. Jed picked out what he needed and lingered, waiting, watching the road like Clara might show up again, but she didn't. He rode slower on the way home, eyes catching every trail leading into the woods that bordered the far east of his land. It was instinct, not plan, that made him tug the reins when he reached the fork near the dry creek bed. The sun was lower than it should have been for a detour, but something tugged at him. The trail narrowed, branches brushing his coat until the path turned to gravel and dust. That's when he saw it. A slanted shack with weathered boards and a stovepipe coughing out weak smoke. It looked like it had once been a miner's hut, long abandoned, but someone had patched it with care. Clothes hung on a line strung between two trees. A small wooden crate had been turned into a makeshift step at the door. He stopped his horse behind a thicket and dismounted silently. The door creaked open and Clara stepped out holding a pot of stew. She wore the same scarf he'd seen her in at the ranch, though the colors looked more faded now in the dying light. And behind her came movement, 4 small figures tumbling out after her like chicks after a hen. One of them, a girl of maybe 10, reached for the pot. Clara gently pulled it higher, shaking her head, then poured the contents into 5 tin bowls. The children sat on the steps and dirt with the ease of routine, cradling their meals like treasures. Jed stood still as stone. Clara didn't speak to the children as they ate, but her eyes stayed on them, watching, measuring how much each child had taken. The youngest, a girl no older than 4, spilled some of hers and burst into tears. Clara scooped her into her arms and whispered something only she could hear, rocking her gently. The others looked away, pretending not to notice. That was the kind of family this was, one where sorrow didn't get indulged for long because survival didn't allow it. Jed swallowed hard. He hadn't known. Not once had she let it slip. All this time, she'd shown up with clean clothes and steady hands, scrubbing his floors while her own children waited hungry in a shack. He turned before she could see him. He didn't want pity to be the first emotion between them. Back on the ranch, he unsaddled the horse in silence, every motion tight with guilt. The next morning, Clara came as usual. She didn't seem any different, but Jed couldn't look at her the same. When she went to refill her bucket, he laid $2 extra on the counter and set a small bag of dried beans beside it. She returned and paused at the sight, her hand hovering over the money. "Pays more today," he said, pretending to oil the hinges on the back door. She didn't argue, just tucked the bills away, quietly sliding the bag of beans into her basket. He didn't ask about the children. She didn't offer. But from then on, he left small things without comment. A half loaf of bread, a block of cheese that wasn't moldy yet, a pair of mittens left drying by the stove that he insisted he had no use for. Weeks passed like that. Little by little, the distance between them shortened, though neither ever said a word about it. One day, she came late and looked apologetic. "I had to see about my youngest," she said. "Fever." Jed nodded, then hesitated. "She all right?" Clara's shoulders relaxed a fraction. "Better now." He cleared his throat. "You bring 'em here if it's bad. Cabin's got space. Stove works." She didn't answer right away, just returned to scrubbing the sink. But he noticed her eyes stayed damp longer than usual that day. The first time she brought them, it was because the rain had come down fast and cold, and they were waiting outside in it. Jed opened the door without a word. The kids filed in one by one, polite, quiet, soaked through. Clara stood just inside the door, clutching her shawl. "They'll stay out of your way," she promised. "They don't have to," Jed replied. Ben, the middle boy, was the first to speak. "You got horses?" Jed cracked the smallest of smiles. "Sure do." From that moment, it was like the ranch exhaled. The kids moved through it with curiosity and reverence, never breaking things, never loud. The older girl, Lily, helped in the kitchen without needing to be asked. Ben followed Jed into the barn and watched him repair a saddle, asking questions like a sponge soaking water. Tommy, the quiet one, sat near the hearth with a sketchbook Clara had packed in her basket. The youngest, Ellie, found a doll forgotten in the attic and treated it like gold. Jed didn't say it aloud, but he looked forward to their visits more than anything now. Clara moved more freely when the children were around, her laughter peeking out in rare bursts. He caught himself watching her from the porch, not out of scrutiny, but peace. She belonged there more than the silence ever had. One morning, he found Lily folding his shirts. She did it the way his wife used to, tight and neat, like care folded into fabric. He didn't stop her. "Ma says you're kind," she said without looking up. He blinked. "Does she?" "She says not many folks are." He nodded once. "Well, she's kind too." Lily gave a small smile and kept folding. After they left that evening, Jed sat at the table with 5 empty mugs still warm from cocoa and a rag doll tucked under the bench. He didn't move it. The next week, Clara came without the children. "Rain's coming," she said. "Didn't want 'em caught in it." Jed nodded. He noticed her hands trembled when she set down her basket. "You all right?" She hesitated. "I'm just tired." He stepped aside so she could sit. She didn't argue this time. She folded her hands in her lap and stared at the fire. "I never meant for you to see that shack," she said quietly. "I know. I didn't want pity. This ain't pity." She looked at him then, her eyes full of shame and gratitude knotted together. "I do my best," she whispered. "I know you do." A long silence stretched between them. Then she said, "My husband left 3 years ago. Disappeared one night. I thought maybe he'd died. Turns out he just didn't want to be poor anymore." Jed nodded slowly, watching the flames. "Men like that run easy," he said. She looked at him. "What kind of man are you?" He didn't answer. Not right away. Then he said, "One that don't run." The fire popped. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. She stood, smoothing her skirt. "I'll bring the children again next week." "You can bring them whenever you like," she nodded. "Thank you." As she stepped outside, rain began to fall, slow and steady. Jed followed her to the porch and watched her lift her shawl over her head. He wanted to offer her a coat, a ride, 100 things. But she was already moving down the road, the rain soaking the hem of her dress. He stood there until she vanished around the bend, the scent of rain and wood smoke curling in the air. And for the second time, that strange stirring returned to his chest. Not pity, not charity. It was something deeper, something dangerously close to hope. The days lengthened as spring turned to early summer, and with it came change, quiet, steady, and deeper than anyone could see. The grass on Jed's land grew greener, the wildflowers returned in soft bursts of yellow and purple across the hills, and the cabin that once breathed dust now smelled of fresh bread, firewood, and lavender soap. It was Clara's doing, all of it, not through loud declarations or force, but the way a river changes rock, slow, patient, unrelenting. She came every other day now. Sometimes with the children, sometimes without. The path from the shack to Jed's ranch had become familiar to them all. The younger ones no longer clung to Clara's skirts when they arrived. They ran barefoot across the porch and into the yard like it was already theirs. Jed didn't stop them. Didn't correct their laughter, even when it echoed too loudly into the barn rafters. He found himself waiting on the porch in the morning she was due, cup in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon, heart pacing just a little faster when he caught sight of her figure rounding the bend. Lily had taken to sitting at the kitchen table to do her sums on scraps of paper. Clara had once said she was smart with numbers, and Jed could see it. She concentrated hard, tongue pressed to her lip, brow furrowed like an old soul, already tired of life's unfair math. Ben tagged along with Jed more often, always asking about tools, animals, and what made things work. He'd even tried to brand a scrap piece of leather with a coat hanger and almost set the barn on fire. Jed didn't yell, he just showed him the right way instead. Tommy rarely spoke, But Jed had seen him drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick. Pictures of barns, animals, even a figure with a hat and beard. Jed said nothing, but the next day he left out a bundle of charcoal and rough paper. Tommy took it without a word, but Jed found the first sketch pinned to the side of the fireplace that evening. It was of the cabin, smoke rising from the chimney, and 5 stick-figure children drawn beneath the porch. Clara stood among them, smiling, and beside her, Jed, taller than the rest, holding Ellie's hand. Clara's laugh had changed too. It came easier now, like it had remembered how to rise up from somewhere deep. Sometimes Jed caught her humming again, the same tune he'd heard in her first week. She didn't talk much about the past still, but the lines around her eyes softened when she spoke of the children. That shack in the woods still stood, but it seemed smaller now, like it had already started fading into memory. That month, Clara came late one morning, flushed and breathless. Jed met her halfway down the trail. "Sorry," she said. "Lily twisted her ankle in the garden. She's resting now." Jed looked at her. "You all right?" Clara nodded, then looked toward the cabin. "I was afraid you'd think I wasn't coming." Jed squinted toward the horizon, then back at her. "You're always welcome. That don't change with the hour." She hesitated, then stepped up onto the porch with him. "Would you mind if I stayed a little longer today?" "I wouldn't mind," he said. "Not at all." She cleaned the pantry shelves again, even though they didn't need it. When she finished, she stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes lingered on the hearth. "I never thought we'd find a place like this," she said, voice low. "Not after everything." Jed looked up from his work. "It's just a ranch." "No," she said, turning to face him. "It's not." He didn't know how to answer that. So he didn't. He just nodded and left the door open behind him as he went out to the barn. The next day, it rained again. Not a light drizzle, but a full summer storm, thunder cracking the hills wide open and lightning stitching the sky. Jed stood on the porch, eyes scanning the tree line. He hadn't expected Clara that day, but worry tugged at him anyway. Then he saw them. They came over the ridge soaked to the bone, Clara leading Lily gently by the arm, the other children trailing behind, all of them clinging to one another. Jed rushed down the steps. "What in God's name?" "She fell again," Clara said, nearly out of breath. "We had to come." The stove went out at the shack and she was shaking. Jed didn't hesitate. He opened the door wide. "Inside! All of you, go on." They filed in. Jed lit the fire in seconds and threw extra logs on. Clara wrapped Lily in every dry blanket they had, while Jed found old towels and clean clothes from a trunk he hadn't opened in years. Tommy clung to the hearth. Ellie cried softly from the cold. Clara knelt beside them, speaking soft and low. Jed watched them from across the room, watched how Clara's arms pulled them all in, one by one, until they huddled close like a single living thing. That night, she stayed. There wasn't any question about it. Jed laid out the spare mattress on the floor for the boys and made a place for Clara and the girls on the couch and rocking chair. When he handed her a dry shirt and said nothing about where it came from, she didn't ask. He offered her the bed. She refused. "You're the one with the sore back," she said, crossing her arms. "I'm also the one who's not soaked through and carrying 4 children on her hip," he replied. She stared at him, then laughed. Really laughed. He gave up the argument. Morning came soft and gray, the storm passed. But Clara didn't gather the children to leave. Instead, she started breakfast in his kitchen like she had always been there. Jed poured coffee and leaned in the doorway. "You ever think about staying longer?" Clara turned from the stove. "What do you mean?" "I mean here. This place. It doesn't bother me none, you being here. The kids. All of it." She didn't speak for a long moment. Her shoulders rose and fell with her breath. "I'm afraid," she said finally. "Of what?" "That it'll fall apart. That it's too good." Jed looked around. "It's just a cabin." "You know it's not." He set down his cup. "You got my word. I ain't going anywhere unless you tell me to." She turned toward him fully. The space between them felt smaller than ever. "Then I'll stay," she whispered. The next week, Jed cleared out the back room. He patched the roof and fixed the hinges. Ben helped haul in an old bed frame while Lily folded linens. Clara made soup with carrots from Jed's neglected garden. The children no longer asked permission to enter the barn. Jed started leaving out extra eggs on the counter. Tommy's sketches now lined the walls of the sitting room. Ellie had adopted a hen as her pet and named it Sugar. Jed let her, even when the hen started sleeping in a crate by the hearth. One night, Clara sat beside Jed on the porch, the kids already asleep inside. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and the moon was full above them. "I keep thinking this is a dream," she said softly, "that I'll wake up and still be cold." Jed looked at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. He reached over and took them in his. "It's real," he said. "I promise." She squeezed his fingers. "Even if it's just for a little while," she whispered. "Thank you." "It doesn't have to be just a little while," he said. She turned to him, startled. He didn't let go. "You've made this place more alive than it's been in 20 years. You and those kids. You could keep running, or you could stay." Clara's voice caught. "You'd want us here? For good?" He nodded once. "I want you, all of you." Tears gathered in her eyes. She didn't speak, only leaned into him and let herself be held. That night, Jed lay awake in bed, listening to the quiet sounds of a house that was no longer empty. Lily's soft cough, the creak of a board as Ben turned in his sleep, the faint murmur of Clara's voice as she tucked Ellie in. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this. He would never go back to silence. Not now, not after her, not after them. Jed woke before the sun, as he always did, but the house no longer greeted him with the emptiness it once had. He heard movement before his boots hit the floor. A faint giggle from Ellie, the creak of the back door as Ben took scraps to the chickens. Clara's low hum drifting from the stove. And, in the corner, a thud. Tommy's sketchbook falling as he tried to balance it on one knee. Jed rubbed the sleep from his eyes and let the morning roll over him like warmth from the hearth. He didn't remember the last time he felt this kind of peace, but he knew better than to take it for granted. He stood in the doorway and watched Clara. She moved like she belonged in that kitchen, not because someone told her to, but because she'd claimed it. Claimed all of it, quietly, patiently, like she'd always known where things went and just waited for the house to remember too. Her hair was down today, loose in gentle waves. She wore one of Martha's old aprons, tied at the back with a faded red ribbon that fluttered when she turned. She noticed him watching and offered a soft smile. "Coffee's warm," she said, "or close enough." Jed stepped inside. "You been up long? Since before the rooster?" She slid a tin mug toward him. "Ben snuck out early to feed the calf. He's taken a shine to that thing." Jed sipped the coffee, already lukewarm. "He's got a knack." Clara nodded. Her hands were dusted with flour, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She glanced at him, then back to kneading dough. "You sleep all right?" He watched her fingers press into the dough. "Better than I used to." That morning passed with the quiet rhythm of routine. Clara humming, the boys carrying water, Lily sweeping the porch and pretending her ankle didn't still ache. Jed mended the fence rail by the east paddock while Ellie trotted beside him, chattering about names for a kitten she claimed had followed her home, even though he hadn't seen a single stray on the property in weeks. By mid-afternoon, clouds gathered over the ridge. Thunder grumbled low like a dog too tired to bark. Jed packed the tools and headed back. Clara was by the table, her hands still dusted with flour, when he walked in. She didn't say anything right away, just stood with one hand resting on the edge of the wood, staring out the window. The air had thickened, humid and full of storm tension. "You all right?" he asked. She turned her head slowly. Her eyes were glassy, her mouth pressed in a thin line. "I'm late," she whispered. He blinked. "Late for what?" She held his gaze a moment longer. Then her hand moved to her belly. "I'm late, Jed." It took a beat for the words to register. Then, Another before the meaning hit him fully. He set down the tool bag. "You think?" She gave a slow, uncertain nod. He stepped closer. "You sure?" "No." Her voice was barely there. "But I've never been this late." Not without a reason. Jed reached for the back of a chair and sat. "Well." She stared at him, as if waiting for him to panic, to pull away, to say something stupid. He didn't. Instead, he said, "You need to see Doc Halberd. I'll take you." Her expression shifted. "Jed." "We'll find out for sure," he said. "One thing at a time." He stood and walked to the hooks by the door, grabbing his coat. "Kids can stay here with Lily. She's strong. I trust her." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "All right." The ride into town was quiet, not tense, just full of thoughts too big for words. She sat beside him in the wagon, hands clasped in her lap. He could feel her nerves in the stillness of her body, the way she didn't shift even when the wheels hit a rut. Doc Halberd was an old man who rarely smiled and smelled faintly of tobacco and mint. He didn't blink when Jed explained, just nodded, led Clara inside and shut the door. Jed waited on the bench outside the exam room. The air smelled like alcohol and paper. Time crawled. When the door opened, Clara stepped out first, pale and stunned. Doc followed, his face unreadable. "Congratulations, Jed. You've got another one coming." Jed looked at Clara. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't. "I'll see myself out," the doctor muttered. Jed stood slowly. "You all right?" he asked. Clara nodded, though her hands trembled. "I didn't think I could. Not again. Not after." Jed took her hands, ignoring the people passing down the hall. "It's not just you anymore, Clara. It's us. Whatever this is, we're in it together." Her breath hitched. Tears welled, but she blinked them away. On the way back, she laid her head against his shoulder and didn't say a word. The next weeks passed in a blur of adjustment. Clara moved slower now. Jed took on more chores without complaint. Ben stepped up too, helping even before he was asked. Lily watched her mother like a hawk, reading every line in her face. One night, Clara stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching Jed as he dried off after a bath. "You really meant what you said," she murmured. He turned, brow furrowed. "When?" "When you said we were in it together." He crossed the room and brushed her hair from her face. "I meant it then. I mean it now. I'll mean it when we're gray and yelling at each other from opposite porches." She laughed, the sound soft and tired but full. "Marry me," Jed said. Her eyes widened. "I don't mean someday. I mean now. As soon as the preacher's got a clean shirt." Clara stared at him, jaw trembling. "You sure?" she asked. "I've never been more sure of anything." She leaned into his chest and whispered, "Yes." They were married under the same cottonwood tree, where she'd once sat with Lily in her lap while Ellie played in the dirt. The children stood close, dressed in simple clothes they'd cleaned until they shined. Clara wore a white dress that had been Martha's once, but altered by Lily's clever hands. There were no guests, no cake, no choir. But there was love. So much of it, it filled every corner of the land, like spring water breaking through dry ground. Jed held Clara's hand as the sun dipped behind the hills, and for the first time in his life he understood what it meant to be whole. When the baby came, it was dawn. The storm had passed in the night, and the sky was pink with the promise of day. Clara gritted her teeth and bore down as Jed stood beside her, whispering strength into her ear. Then came the cry, loud and clear like a bell rung from heaven. A girl. They named her Grace. Jed held her in his arms, tears dripping into her blanket. "She's beautiful," Clara said weakly. "She's a miracle," Jed replied. The house filled with footsteps again. Lily brought towels. Ben stoked the fire. Ellie sang a lullaby she made up on the spot. Tommy handed Jed a drawing, a picture of the whole family, now with one more. Jed placed it above the mantel. That night, as the baby slept nestled beside Clara, Jed sat on the porch with the stars above him. The land stretched wide and silent, but it no longer felt empty. Inside those walls were voices, laughter, breath, and love. And in his chest, a heart that once beat for no one, now thudded strong for 6. He had paid her once to clean his cabin, but she had done far more than that. She had cleaned his soul, and gave him a life he never dared ask for. The years moved slowly on the land, but not within the home. Inside those walls, time sprinted, tumbled, laughed, wept, and grew. The children, once small enough to be carried on Jed's back or held in Clara's arms, now filled the ranch with their own purpose. Lily, the eldest, matured with the heart of a mother and the eyes of a girl who had seen the worst and still believed in better. She rose with the sun before Clara even stirred, brushing Grace's hair, checking the garden rows, keeping Tommy's notebooks tidy. Ben became Jed's shadow, though he now stood shoulder to shoulder with him, taller than the others, stronger too. He worked the plow with quiet focus and handled the livestock with the same careful hands Jed once had. When asked why he never left the ranch to find a new life in town or follow his own trail, he simply answered, "My life's already here." Tommy grew quieter still, but his drawings no longer hid in the corners. They now filled walls, wooden panels, old feed sacks tacked up proudly in the barn and along the hallway. He painted Grace chasing chickens, Clara laughing in the kitchen, Jed asleep under the porch with a hat over his eyes. He sketched their lives with a precision no camera could catch, capturing the soul behind every smile and gesture. And Ellie, once the smallest voice among them, bloomed into a whirlwind of sound and energy. She never stopped singing. Even when the hens scattered and the dogs howled along, she sang. When Clara scolded her for leaving the door open or not finishing her chores, she sang. She sang Jed to sleep more nights than he could count. Grace, their daughter, his daughter, grew faster than any of them were prepared for. Jed often caught himself just staring at her. She had Clara's eyes, but his scowl when she was thinking hard, which made Clara laugh every time she saw it. She walked early, spoke late, but once she did, she never stopped asking questions. She wanted to know why the sky looked different at dusk than at dawn, why horses sleep standing up, why Jed's hands were so rough, but his voice always got soft when he spoke to Clara. She asked the kinds of things a man like Jed never imagined needing to answer, but now couldn't imagine not having to. The ranch, once a patch of land keeping an old man alive, was now a living thing. It breathed with them, changed with them. The apple trees Clara planted by the fence line bore fruit every fall. The vegetable garden doubled in size. They added a hen house, a smoke shed, even 2 more horses. Jed hadn't touched a ledger in years, but the pantry stayed full, the roof didn't leak, and laughter had a permanent place at the table. He aged. Of course he did. The gray in his beard turned to white. The lines around his eyes deepened. Some days, the cold crept into his knees early, and the mornings took longer to shake the ache from his bones. But when Grace ran across the field shouting, "Papa, look!" as she held up a crooked stick like a sword, or when Clara touched his shoulder as she passed, all that fell away. What remained was purpose, love, a home. One evening he sat beneath the cottonwood tree with Grace curled beside him, watching the sun dip low across the pasture. The sky turned orange, then bruised purple. The cattle shifted lazily in the distance. A hawk glided on the updrafts above, and somewhere down by the creek, a chorus of frogs began their nightly call. "Will you die someday?" Grace asked softly. Jed looked down at her. She was 7 now, old enough to see truth coming, but still too young to understand the weight of it. "Yes," he said, brushing a leaf from her hair. "Someday I will." She thought about that. "Will, Mama?" "Someday, but not for a long time, I hope." She nodded slowly. "And me?" Jed smiled. "Not for a very long, long time." She fell quiet again, head resting on his arm. "If you die, will you still see us?" He paused, looking at the stars just beginning to show. "I think so," he said. "I think love knows how to find its way." even after we go." She nodded again, satisfied for now. Clara found them there an hour later, Grace asleep against his side, his hand resting on her back. She didn't wake them. She just stood under the porch light and watched them breathe. Later that year, Lily left. She'd fallen in love with the preacher's boy, a shy, broad-shouldered fellow named Caleb who'd been coming by with baskets of pears from his father's orchard. Clara saw it coming before anyone else did. Jed took longer to admit it. He didn't say much the day Lily packed her bag. He just stood by the fence, arms crossed, jaw tight. Lily hugged him hard. "You gave me more than a home," she whispered. "You gave me a father." He cleared his throat, but didn't speak. That night, he drank an extra cup of coffee and stared at the empty chair at the table. Clara reached across and held his hand without saying a word. Seasons passed like that, slow, loud, full, sometimes hard. There was the winter Tommy fell off the barn roof trying to chase a pigeon and broke his arm. The day Ellie nearly got bit by a snake near the water trough. The afternoon the east pasture caught fire, and they all had to bucket the flames until they collapsed in soot and laughter. There were days Clara cried, and days Jed cursed, and days where all of them went to bed worn down to the bone. But they always rose again. Then came the summer Jed turned 70. They threw him a party he didn't want, but secretly loved. Clara baked 3 pies. Ben smoked a side of beef so tender it pulled apart in your fingers. Ellie made up a song that rhymed old with gold and bold, and Grace painted him a picture of himself riding a chicken instead of a horse. It made no sense, but he hung it over the mantel anyway. That night, Clara laid her head on his chest in bed. 70 years, she said softly. Not all of them worth counting, he replied. She smiled. But the last 10? He kissed her forehead. Every one. He didn't pass in bed, not surrounded by candles or holding hands. He passed in the barn sitting on an upturned bucket, watching the sunset through a crack in the wood, his hat tipped back, a smile on his face. Ben found him there hours later, still and peaceful. Clara didn't weep like she thought she would. She held him. She kissed his cheek. She told the children he went out the way he wanted to, on his land, in peace, knowing he'd done right by those he loved. They buried him beneath the cottonwood tree, the same one where he'd asked Clara to marry him, the same tree where Grace once asked about death and the stars above. The entire town came. Lily and Caleb held hands as they stood beside the grave. Ben gave the eulogy, voice cracking only once when he called Jed, the best man I ever knew. Tommy left a drawing tucked into the stone, one of Jed with his hat tipped and a cup of coffee in hand. Ellie sang. Clara just sat on the bench beside the grave, Grace at her side, hands clasped tight. Years later, the ranch still stood. Clara still rose before the sun. Grace took over Lily's role and ran the house with her mother's fierce grace. Ben stayed on the land, raising cattle, running herds, building barns, and passing down everything Jed ever taught him. Tommy became an artist known across the territory, but he never stopped mailing drawings back home, each one signed with a small T and a heart. Ellie became a teacher, the kind that never yelled, but whose classroom was always full of noise and wonder. And every Sunday, Clara walked out to the cottonwood tree with her cane and her shawl and sat by Jed's grave. She told him about the week, about the chickens, about Grace's new sweetheart, and how Tommy was coming to visit. She told him how much she missed him, and how thankful she still was that he'd once paid her to clean his cabin, because in doing so, he gave her the life she never dared hope for. Sometimes, love doesn't arrive with thunder or grand gestures. It comes quietly, like a knock on the door from someone just looking for a job, and ends up building a home, a family, and a forever. Jed Hollis thought his life was nearing its final chapter, but with Clara and the children he discovered it was only just beginning. In a world where second chances are rare, theirs was a love story carved in dust, sweat, and grace, one that proves the heart can still bloom, even after years of silence. If stories of hope, heart, and healing in the untamed West speak to your soul, Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles. Ride along with us for more unforgettable tales of love found in the most unexpected places. Your next favorite story is just a click away. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment where love changes everything.